hated by the queen, despised by the court as a degenerate madman, and rumored to be a homosexual who preferred the company of handsome men to his wife, he was considered a disgrace to his lineage. Yet he remained on the throne of an absolute monarchy for over 40 years, died a king, and was finally laid to rest in the sacred crypts of Roskilde Cathedral, one of the greatest kings in the history of his people. His name was King Christian VII of Denmark. How could a man whose forbidden love for men made him an outcast in the eyes of the court be allowed to wear the crown of God's anointed until his last breath? To truly understand how such a seismic event could occur, we must first step back into the vibrant, often brutal world of mid-18th century Europe. It was an era of profound contradiction. On one hand, the Enlightenment was dawning, a brilliant sunrise of reason, science, and a belief in human progress. Philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau were challenging the old certainties, their ideas spreading through the salons of Paris and the universities of Germany. Yet at the same time, the ancient structures of power remained firmly in place. This was still an age of absolute monarchy, of rigid social hierarchies, and of courts that were glittering hotbeds of intrigue, tradition, and personal ambition. Denmark and Norway, a unified kingdom at the time, found itself caught in this cross-current of old and new. It was a respectable mid-tier European power, but it was a kingdom wrestling with its own identity. The Danish court was, paradoxically, more German than Danish. For generations, German had been the language of the elite, of culture, and of governance. The nobility, a powerful and deeply entrenched class, held immense sway, often clashing with the monarch for control. This created a delicate, often volatile political balance. Power was a constant shifting dance between the king and his privy council, the Rigsråd, which was dominated by these conservative land-owning aristocrats. Into this complex world, on January 29, 1749, a crown prince was born. He was named Christian, and he arrived amidst the gilded splendor of Christiansborg Palace. His lineage was impeccable. His father was King Frederick V of Denmark and Norway, and his mother was the beloved Queen Louise, herself the daughter of Great Britain's King George II. On paper, the boy's future was as bright and secure as any in Europe. The kingdom celebrated his birth with cannonades and court balls, seeing in him the promise of continuity and stability. But fate and the cruel lottery of genetics and upbringing had a far darker path in store for him. His father, King Frederick V, was a man who embodied the Rococo spirit of the age, charming, pleasure-loving, and a great patron of the arts. But he was also a man deeply uncomfortable with the burdens of rule. He spoke German, not Danish, and preferred the company of artists and actors to his ministers. He was a notorious hedonist, his days and nights often lost in a haze of alcohol and revelry. Consequently, the actual business of governing was left to his talented ministers, most notably the astute Count von Moltke. His father left governance to his ministers, creating a monarchy where the king reigned but did not rule. It created a power vacuum at the very center of the court, a vacuum that others would one day rush to fill. The saving grace of Christian's earliest years was his mother, Queen Louise. She was intelligent, cultured, and immensely popular with the Danish people. Unlike her husband, she made an effort to learn the Danish language and was a stabilizing, gentle influence in a court often dominated by frivolity. She provided a bubble of warmth and affection for her young children. For the first 2 years of his life, Prince Christian knew a mother's love, but this fragile sanctuary was about to be shattered. In 1751, following a miscarriage, Queen Louise died suddenly. She was only 27 years old. For the kingdom, it was a tragedy. For the 2-year-old crown prince, it was a catastrophe from which he would never recover. The loss of his mother was the first great trauma in a life that would be defined by it. It extinguished the primary source of light and affection in his world, leaving him adrift in the cold, formal currents of the court. King Frederick V, lost in his own grief and alcoholism, remarried within a year. His new bride was Juliana Maria of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel. She was pious, stern, and deeply conservative, the polar opposite of the vivacious Louise. She fulfilled her duty, bearing the king a son, Prince Frederick, but she never managed to forge a bond with her stepson, Christian. There was a coldness between them, an emotional distance that would later curdle into suspicion and outright political animosity. Juliana Maria saw Christian's emerging eccentricities not as a sign of distress, but as a weakness of character, a flaw in the royal line. She focused her ambitions on her own son, creating a rival power center within the royal family. Young Christian was now not only motherless, but also emotionally isolated, an outsider in his own home. With his father absent and his stepmother distant, the crucial task of Christian's education fell to a man named Detlev von Reventlow. This appointment would prove to be an unmitigated disaster. Reventlow was a product of his time, a believer in the pedagogical philosophy that a child's will must be broken before it could be properly formed. He saw Christian's sensitivity, his nervous energy, and his flashes of erratic behavior as sheer stubbornness that needed to be stamped out. His methods were not just strict, they were sadistic. The young prince was subjected to a relentless regime of physical and psychological abuse for the smallest infraction, or sometimes for no reason at all. He was beaten with whips, canes, even a leather flapper used on his hands and face. One can only imagine the terror of this young child, already grieving and confused, being systematically tortured by the very person entrusted with his care. This wasn't education. It was the systematic destruction of a fragile mind. The abuse had a predictable and devastating effect. Instead of breaking Christian's will, it shattered his psyche. The early signs of his mental illness, which may have been manageable with kindness and support, were now horrifically exacerbated. He began to exhibit alarming behaviors that went far beyond childish mischief. He developed a terrifyingly violent temper, flying into uncontrollable rages where he would smash furniture and attack his attendants. He was plagued by paranoia and vivid hallucinations. Historians believe he heard voices and saw things that weren't there. He also developed a cruel streak, a desperate attempt to exert the control that had been so brutally denied to him. He would torment animals and servants, finding a perverse pleasure in their fear. He became obsessed with his own fantasies, often forcing his companions to act out bizarre, violent scenarios. There were also periods of profound withdrawal where he would become catatonic, staring into space for hours, lost in the terrifying landscape of his own mind. Perhaps most disturbingly, he began to engage in self-harm, hitting his head against walls or beating his own body, as if trying to punish himself for the demons that haunted him. This was the boy who was destined to become the absolute monarch of Denmark and Norway. The court whispered about his strangeness, but the full horrifying extent of his condition was a secret kept locked away behind palace walls. On January 14th, 1766, King Frederick V died, his body finally succumbing to decades of hard living. All at once, the 17-year-old Christian was King Christian VII. The news was met with a mixture of apprehension and forced optimism. The Danish people, who knew little of his true state, hoped that the responsibilities of the crown would mature the young monarch. The court's inner circle knew better. They saw a volatile, unpredictable boy king, and they immediately began to jockey for position, seeking to influence and control him for their own ends. From the very first day of his reign, it was clear that the optimists were wrong. Christian's behavior became even more erratic. He delighted in shocking the staid and formal court. He would gallop his horse wildly through Copenhagen streets, often with his favorite companion, a notorious prostitute named Støvlet Catherine. He and his small coterie of dissolute young noblemen would roam the city's taverns and brothels, getting into drunken brawls, smashing windows, and terrorizing the citizenry. It was a desperate, chaotic cry for freedom from a young man who had been a prisoner his entire life. But for a king, it was scandalous. He treated the solemn affairs of state as a joke, making obscene gestures during council meetings and signing official documents with a rubber stamp he had fashioned. His ministers were horrified. They tried to manage him, to steer him, but it was like trying to reason with a hurricane. In the midst of this chaos, a decision was made. A wife, it was thought, would be a steadying influence. A queen would bring dignity to the court and, most importantly, produce an heir to secure the succession. The choice fell upon Christian's first cousin, the 15-year-old Princess Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, youngest sister of King George III. She was, by all accounts, a perfect candidate. Raised in the relatively sheltered environment of the British court, she was beautiful, vivacious, and intelligent. She loved music, dancing, and riding, and possessed a spirited, if somewhat naive, nature. She knew little of her future husband, save that he was a king. One can imagine her girlish excitement, her dreams of a grand court and a handsome royal husband. The reality would be a waking nightmare. The marriage took place by proxy in London in October 1766. A few weeks later, Caroline Matilda embarked on her journey to Denmark, a teenage girl leaving everything she had ever known for a new life in a foreign land. Her arrival in Copenhagen was met with public celebration, but her first encounter with her husband was a chilling omen of things to come. Christian treated her with a cold public indifference that quickly escalated into outright cruelty. He was often rude to her in front of the entire court, mocking her attempts to speak German and French, and making it painfully clear that he found her presence an imposition. Their wedding night was a disaster. Christian, it seemed, was either unable or unwilling to consummate the marriage. He publicly flaunted his continued relationship with Støvlet Catherine and other courtesans, a calculated and deeply personal humiliation for his young bride. Here she was, a queen, trapped in a loveless, sexless marriage, her husband a man whose behavior swung wildly between childish pranks and frightening outbursts of rage. She was utterly alone. The Danish court was a labyrinth of intrigue, and its language and customs were alien to her. The powerful Dowager Queen, Juliana Maria, watched her with a hawk-like jealousy, seeing the young British princess as a rival to her own influence. Caroline Matilda tried to fulfill her role. She was formally crowned in May 1767, and to the immense relief of the court, she managed to conceive a child. In January 1768, she gave birth to a son, the future King Frederick VI. She had done her duty. She had provided an heir, but this achievement did nothing to improve her relationship with her husband. If anything, Christian grew even more distant, more erratic. He would burst into her chambers at night not for intimacy, but to scream at her, to make bizarre pronouncements, or to engage in manic, destructive behavior. He once cut up the tapestries in her room with a sword during one of his fits. Caroline Matilda, once a bright and hopeful girl, a prisoner in a golden cage, starved of affection and intellectual companionship. The stage was now perfectly set. A broken king an isolated queen, and a kingdom adrift. All that was needed was a catalyst, a new player to step onto this fraught and fragile stage and change the game forever. And he was coming. By the spring of 1768, the situation at the Danish court had reached a breaking point. The king, Christian VII, was spiraling deeper into his own private chaos. His nightly escapades in the seediest corners of Copenhagen were not only a royal embarrassment, but a genuine security risk. His behavior in the council chambers was increasingly bizarre and obstructive. The ministers, led by the experienced and formidable Count von Bernstorff, were in a state of quiet desperation. Something had to be done. A plan was devised, born more of hope than of strategy, a grand tour of Europe. This was a time-honored tradition for young monarchs. The tour was meant to be a finishing school in statecraft and culture, an opportunity to forge diplomatic ties and observe the great courts of the continent. For Christian, however, the ministers had a more urgent therapeutic goal. They hoped that the novelty of travel, the exposure to the sophisticated courts of England and France, and simply removing him from the toxic environment of his own court might have a calming, maturing effect. It was a desperate gamble to try and salvage the mind of their king. But such a journey with such a volatile principal traveler presented an immense challenge. They needed a special kind of physician, someone who could manage Christian's health, both physical and mental, discreetly and effectively, far from the prying eyes of Copenhagen. The search led them to a 30-year-old German doctor practicing in Altona, a town near Hamburg, then under the Danish crown. His name was Johann Friedrich Struensee. On the surface, he seemed an unlikely choice for a royal physician. He was not a nobleman. He was the son of a pious, rigid Lutheran pastor, but he himself was the very opposite of his father. Struensee was a man forged in the crucible of the Enlightenment. He was a rationalist, a skeptic, a believer in science and reason over dogma and tradition. His mind was sharp, his curiosity boundless, and his ambition, though carefully concealed, was immense. As a physician in Altona, he had already gained a reputation for his progressive and sometimes controversial ideas. He championed public sanitation, advocated for reforms in childcare, and wrote articles that subtly questioned the established social order. He was charismatic, handsome, and possessed an easy confidence that drew people to him. But he was also a man of contradictions, a dedicated doctor who also enjoyed a libertine lifestyle, a serious intellectual who understood the mechanics of charm and seduction. He was recommended to the court by a nobleman he had treated, and after a brief interview, he was offered the temporary post of traveling physician to His Majesty, the King. For Struensee, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. For the Danish court, it was a decision that would alter the course of their nation's history. No one, least of all Struensee himself, could have possibly imagined where this journey would lead. The tour began in May 1768, and almost immediately, Struensee proved his worth. He possessed a remarkable insight into the king's fractured psyche. Where others had used force, restraint, and moral condemnation, Struensee employed a radical new approach. He listened. He did not judge Christian's darkest impulses or his most bizarre fantasies. Instead, he engaged with them, treating the king not as a madman to be controlled, but as a complex individual in profound distress. He understood that much of Christian's behavior was a desperate cry for attention and a rebellion against a lifetime of oppressive authority. So Struensee adopted a strategy of calculated indulgence. If the king wished to stay up all night drinking, Struensee would join him, steering him away from public brawls and toward more private, manageable revels. If the king descended into a paranoid rant, Struensee would calmly talk him through his fears, offering rational explanations and a reassuring presence. He prescribed a regimen of exercise, hot baths, and a stable diet. He became less of a doctor and more of a friend, a confidant, a protective older brother. For the first time in his life, Christian had found someone who did not fear him, did not want to punish him, and did not simply want to use him. He found someone who seemed, astonishingly, to understand him. The king, so starved of genuine human connection, began to cling to Struensee with a fierce, almost total dependency. The tour was, on the surface, a remarkable success. In England, Christian was received by his brother-in-law, King George III. While the British monarch was privately appalled by Christian's erratic behavior, Struensee's skillful management kept any major diplomatic incidents at bay. In Paris, the crucible of the Enlightenment, Christian's entourage was fated by the intellectual elite. Struensee was in his element here, conversing with encyclopedists and philosophers like Diderot and d'Alembert. He drank in their radical ideas about governance, liberty, and the rights of man, ideas that would soon form the blueprint for his own revolution. All the while, he kept the Danish king stable and presentable enough to fulfill his ceremonial duties. The ministers back in Copenhagen received glowing reports. Their gamble, it seemed, had paid off. The king appeared to be improving. In reality, the king wasn't changing. The man who controlled him was. When the royal tour returned to Copenhagen in January 1769, Christian was a changed man only in one respect. He was now incapable of functioning without Johann Friedrich Struensee by his side. The German doctor was no longer a temporary hire. He was an indispensable fixture of the court. He was given the title of Reader to the King and granted luxurious apartments within the palace itself. The old guard, including Count Bernstorff, saw this as a positive development. They still viewed Struensee as a useful, non-political tool, a skilled king handler who would keep Christian occupied and allow them to get on with the serious business of running the country. They had gravely, fatally underestimated his ambition. While Struensee had conquered the king, the queen was another matter. Caroline Matilda was initially deeply suspicious of this charismatic German doctor. She saw him as just another courtier, another sycophant, who managed her husband's madness for his own gain. She maintained a cool, formal distance. But Struensee was a patient man, and he knew that to truly secure his position, he needed the queen's trust as well. His opportunity came not through a courtly intrigue, but through a medical crisis. In the autumn of 1769, the terrifying specter of smallpox haunted Europe. It was a merciless killer, especially of children. When the infant Crown Prince Frederick fell ill, panic swept through the palace. Struensee saw his chance. He was a proponent of a new controversial technique called inoculation, a precursor to vaccination, which involved introducing a small amount of the virus to build immunity. It was a risky procedure, and the established court physicians were horrified by the idea. But Caroline Matilda, terrified of losing her only child, was desperate. She put her faith in the confident young doctor. Struensee performed the inoculation himself, and he nursed the young prince through the ensuing fever. The gamble paid off. The Crown Prince recovered fully, now immune to the disease that had killed millions. For Caroline Matilda, it was nothing short of a miracle. Her gratitude towards Struensee was boundless. He had not only saved her son, he had shown courage and conviction in the face of conservative opposition. Her suspicion melted away, replaced by a profound sense of admiration and trust. She began to see him not as a courtier, but as a man of substance, of science, and of action. This shared crisis opened the door to a deeper connection. Struensee began to spend more time with the queen. He discovered what the rest of the court had ignored, that behind her regal facade was a sharp, inquisitive mind and a passionate heart, both of which had been left to atrophy in the stifling, lonely atmosphere of the court. He spoke to her not about court gossip, but about literature, philosophy, and the exciting new ideas sweeping across Europe. He recommended books to her, works by Rousseau and Voltaire that spoke of personal freedom and emotional honesty. For the first time since arriving in Denmark, Caroline Matilda had found someone who treated her as an intellectual equal, who saw her as a person, not just a queen. He listened to her frustrations, her loneliness, her despair over her marriage. He offered sympathy, understanding, and a perspective that was refreshingly free from the rigid etiquette of the court. For a young woman who had been so profoundly isolated, these conversations were like water in a desert. An intellectual and emotional bond began to form, a bond that was dangerously potent. The lonely queen and the ambitious doctor found in each other a kindred spirit. And soon, this meeting of minds would ignite into a passion that would consume them both. As his influence over the royal couple grew, so did Struensee's political ambition. He was no longer content to be a mere physician. He saw a kingdom stagnating under the control of an entrenched, conservative aristocracy, and he saw a king who would do anything he asked. It was the perfect storm, a unique opportunity to seize power and reshape an entire nation according to his own enlightened principles. A tacit alliance was formed: Christian, who was completely dependent on him; Caroline Matilda, who was rapidly falling in love with him; and Struensee himself, the mastermind. He began his silent coup with meticulous precision. He played on Christian's deep-seated paranoia, subtly convincing the king that his ministers and the Privy Council were his enemies, that they looked down on him, that they were plotting to usurp his authority. It was a cruel but effective manipulation of a sick man's fears. One by one, he began to isolate and undermine the members of the old guard. His primary target was the most powerful man in Denmark, Count von Bernstorff. The final confrontation came in September of 1770. After a carefully orchestrated campaign of whispers and accusations, Struensee convinced the king to dismiss his long-serving chief minister. Christian, in a moment of suggestibility, signed the order. The news of Bernstorff's fall from grace sent a shockwave through Denmark and across the courts of Europe. It was a clear and unambiguous signal that the old regime was over. A new unknown power was now in command. With Bernstorff gone, the path was clear. Struensee persuaded the king to dissolve the Privy Council entirely. In its place, he had Christian sign a cabinet order, granting him the authority of maître des requêtes, or master of petitions. This seemingly innocuous title gave him an unprecedented power, the right to issue laws and decrees directly, in the king's name, without any need for consultation or approval. In a matter of months, with astonishing speed and audacity, Johann Friedrich Struensee, the common-born German doctor, had become the absolute ruler of Denmark and Norway. He stood at the zenith of power, the queen by his side, and a nation at his feet, ready to be remade in his own image. The most radical and dangerous phase of his revolution was about to begin. With the old guard swept aside and the king's authority his to command, Johann Friedrich Struensee did not just walk into the halls of power, he stormed them. The 16 months following his ascension in late 1770 were a political whirlwind, a period of such radical and rapid transformation that it left the nation of Denmark breathless, dizzy, and dangerously divided. This was the dawn of the Struensee era. Working with a ferocious, almost manic intensity, he unleashed a veritable flood of legislation. In just over 480 days, more than 1,800 laws and decrees poured out of his office, an average of 3 to 4 a day. He was a man possessed by an idea to drag a conservative, feudalistic kingdom, kicking and screaming, into the bright, rational light of the Enlightenment. One of his very first acts, and perhaps his most famous, was to declare the complete and unrestricted freedom of the press. In September 1770, a simple decree swept away generations of censorship. For the first time, anyone could print and say anything they wished without fear of government reprisal. It was a purely idealistic, Enlightenment-driven move. Struensee believed that reason and truth would naturally triumph in a free marketplace of ideas. He imagined learned journals and philosophical debates. What he got was a deluge, an explosion of pamphlets, newspapers, and satirical leaflets flooded the streets of Copenhagen. And in a stroke of profound and tragic irony, this newfound freedom became the primary weapon used by his enemies to destroy him. He had, in essence, handed them the sword with which they would cut his throat. But in the beginning, he was too consumed by his grand project to notice. He was dismantling the old world, piece by piece. He declared war on the entrenched privileges of the nobility, introducing tax reforms that aimed to distribute the burden more equitably. He took the first crucial steps toward abolishing serfdom, a system that kept tenant farmers in a state of near slavery. With a stroke of his pen, he abolished the use of torture in the judicial system, a practice common throughout Europe, placing Denmark at the very vanguard of humanitarian law. His reforming zeal was relentless, and it was ruthless. He attacked the bloated and inefficient state bureaucracy with the precision of a surgeon. Entire government departments were eliminated overnight. Hundreds of civil servants and court officials, many of whom had held their positions for life, were summarily fired, their pensions canceled. While this undoubtedly made the state more efficient, it also created a powerful, angry class of dispossessed gentlemen with deep connections and very long memories. He slashed the court's extravagant budget, seeing its pomp and ceremony as a wasteful relic. He even disbanded the prestigious Royal Horse Guards, a corps of noble officers, dismissing their role as purely ornamental. This act, meant to save money, was a grave political error, deeply offending the pride and power of the military establishment. And through all of this, there was another, deeply resonant source of resentment. Every single one of these revolutionary decrees was written and issued in German. Struensee, despite ruling Denmark, never bothered to learn the Danish language. To the common people, to the Danish clergy, to the budding nationalists within the intellectual class, this was the ultimate insult. It confirmed their worst fears, that their king had been bewitched and their country had been conquered not by an army but by a single arrogant German doctor. While Struensee waged his public war on the old order, he and Queen Caroline Matilda were conducting a private revolution of their own. Their intellectual and emotional connection had deepened into a passionate, all-consuming love affair, and they made little effort to hide it. In an age of discreet liaisons and courtly pretense, their openness was breathtakingly scandalous. Struensee was moved into apartments in Christiansborg Palace that were directly connected to the Queen's. They were a constant presence in each other's lives, a ruling couple in all but name. They would spend their days riding together far from the prying eyes of the court. Caroline Matilda, once so constrained by protocol, felt a thrilling sense of liberation. She famously adopted a daring, masculine-style riding habit, which, while practical, was seen by her critics as yet another sign of her shameless immorality. Together, they took charge of the upbringing of the young Crown Prince Frederick, implementing the radical new educational theories of the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. They sought to raise a new kind of king, an unspoiled child of nature, free from the corrupting influence of the court. To the conservatives, this looked like a dangerous social experiment being conducted on the future of the monarchy. In the summer of 1771, their affair produced its most undeniable and dangerous consequence. On July 7th, Queen Caroline Matilda gave birth to a daughter, Princess Louise Augusta. Throughout the court, and indeed throughout the kingdom, no one had any doubt as to the identity of the child's father. The baby was immediately and derisively nicknamed La Petite Struensee. The scandal had now become flesh and blood, a living symbol of the queen's adultery and the doctor's usurpation. The king's own reaction was, like everything else about him, tragic and bizarre. At the official christening, Christian VII, in a moment of confused lucidity, reportedly made a remark to a courtier that openly questioned his own paternity of the child. It was as if even he, in the fog of his illness, understood the depth of his wife's betrayal and his own humiliating irrelevance. For Caroline Matilda, this period was a paradox. She had found the great love of her life. She was intellectually and politically engaged, a true partner to the man who now ran her kingdom. She felt alive, empowered, and free for the first time. But her every act of defiance, her every moment of happiness with Struensee, was adding fuel to a fire that was growing closer and closer, threatening to consume them all. As Struensee and the Queen remade the world in their own image, another world was taking shape in the shadows, a world of whispers, prayers, and plots. At the heart of this growing opposition was the Dowager Queen, Juliana Maria. She watched the new regime with a potent mixture of pious horror and cold political calculation. She saw Struensee as an atheistic usurper, a German adventurer who had bewitched her stepson and seduced his wife. But she also saw an opportunity. The growing scandal was the perfect justification for a coup that would sweep Struensee aside and place her own son, Prince Frederick, at the center of power as regent. But Juliana Maria was not a warrior. She was a strategist. She needed an intellectual champion, a propagandist who could channel the simmering public resentment into a focused weapon. She found him in Ove Guldberg. Guldberg was Prince Frederick's tutor, a theologian, historian, and a fervent Danish nationalist. He was everything Struensee was not: conservative, deeply religious, and a master of the Danish language. He saw the Struensee era as a foreign sickness infecting the soul of his nation. With Juliana Maria's backing, Guldberg began to orchestrate a brilliant and vicious propaganda campaign. Using the very freedom of the press that Struensee had granted, Guldberg and his allies flooded Copenhagen with anonymous pamphlets. They painted Struensee as a power-hungry tyrant, a lecherous foreigner who controlled the king like a puppet. They portrayed Queen Caroline Matilda not as a lonely woman who had found love, but as a depraved, unnatural adulteress, a disgrace to her throne and her gender. These weren't subtle political critiques. They were brutal character assassinations designed to inflame public morality and patriotism, and they were devastatingly effective. The coalition of the discontented grew by the day. There were the hundreds of fired government officials, the humiliated nobles, the offended military officers, and the conservative clergy who preached from their pulpits against the godless new regime. Even the common people of Copenhagen, who might have benefited from some of Struensee's social reforms, were turned against him by the constant attacks on his character and the scandal of his affair with the Queen. And what of Struensee amidst this gathering storm? At the very height of his power, he was consumed by a fatal arrogance. He was an idealist who believed so completely in the righteousness of his own reforms that he could not comprehend the depth of the hatred he had inspired. He worked tirelessly, often 18 hours a day, micromanaging every aspect of the state. This left him isolated, cut off from the political realities on the ground. He had allies, but he failed to cultivate them. He had a king's authority, but he failed to build a loyal power base. When courtiers brought him warnings of the plots being hatched against him, he dismissed them as the jealous grumblings of the old guard. He placed his faith in two things: the unshakable power of the king's signature and the love of his queen. He believed himself to be untouchable. He was blind to the fact that his fortress was built on the most unstable foundations imaginable: the mind of a mad king and the heart of a disgraced queen. By the winter of 1771, the conspiracy had solidified. The Dowager Queen, Goldberg, and a handful of high-ranking disaffected military officers, led by General Rantzau, were finalizing their plans. The time to strike was drawing near. They needed only the right moment, a moment when the palace was distracted, its guard down. They found their perfect opportunity in the date of a grand masquerade ball, scheduled for the evening of January 16th, 1772. As the court prepared its masks and costumes, blissfully unaware, the conspirators were sharpening their knives. The final act of this royal tragedy was about to begin. Every story has a tipping point, a single moment when the future fractures and everything changes forever. For the reign of Johann Friedrich Struensee and Queen Caroline Matilda, that moment arrived cloaked in velvet and silk, hidden behind the false smiles of painted masks. The court theater was a dizzying spectacle of artificial gaiety. The air was thick with the scent of perfume and wine, but thicker still with unspoken tensions. This was the final glittering night of a doomed era, and almost no one in the room knew it. Struensee and the Queen moved through the ball with an air of untouchable authority. They were at the very apex of their power, the architects of a new Denmark, and they saw no reason for fear. Why should they? The king's seal authenticated their every move, and their love for each other felt like an impenetrable shield. But across the room, other eyes were watching. Behind the impassive masks of a fox and a domino, Dowager Queen Juliana Maria and her co-conspirator Ove Goldberg observed the scene with cold patience. Their agents were in place. The military officers in on the plot, led by the grizzled General Rantzau, mingled with the crowd, their minds not on the music, but on the precise timing of the treachery to come. Every polite nod, every shared glass of wine was part of a terrifying, silent countdown. The ball finally wound down in the icy cold early hours of January 17th. As the final notes of the orchestra faded away, the royal couple retired to their chambers, exhausted but content. The palace settled into a deep, deceptive quiet. This was the signal. The moment the conspirators had been waiting for had arrived. The masquerade was over and the coup was about to begin. The success of the entire plot hinged on one thing: securing the king's signature. Without it, their actions would be nothing more than treason. Everything depended on manipulating the fragile mind of Christian VII. Just before 4 a.m., Rantzau and his men burst into the royal bedchamber. They woke the king from a deep sleep. Christian, terrified and disoriented, sat bolt upright in bed, blinking in the sudden lantern light. Rantzau, his voice a mixture of feigned panic and stern authority, fed the king a carefully crafted lie. He told Christian that Struensee was a traitor, that at that very moment he was raising a rebellion to assassinate the king and seize the throne for himself. To the king's paranoid and suggestible mind, already conditioned by Struensee's enemies to fear betrayal, The story was horribly plausible. Panic seized him. As he trembled in his bed, the conspirators presented him with a stack of pre-written arrest warrants. The first one bore the name of Johann Friedrich Struensee. The second, that of Queen Caroline Matilda. In his state of abject terror, unable to distinguish friend from foe, Christian took the quill they offered him and signed his name. With that single coerced scrawl, he sealed the fate of the two people who had, in their own complicated ways, cared for him most. He had signed their death warrant and the warrant for the destruction of their entire world. With the king's legal authority now in their hands, the conspirators moved with brutal efficiency. One detachment of soldiers stormed Struensee's apartments. They found him asleep in his bed. He awoke to bayonets gleaming in candlelight. For a moment, defiant. Then he saw the warrant, bearing the king's signature. In that instant, he understood. The game was over. The arrest of the queen was even more cruel. When the soldiers, led by Rantzau himself, forced their way into her chambers, she reacted not with fear, but with furious royal indignation. But her authority was gone. They shoved the warrant in her face. When she saw her husband's signature, her anger turned to disbelief, then to sheer horror. Her first thoughts were for her children. She ran towards the nursery, desperate to reach her infant daughter, Louise Augusta, but she was blocked by the soldiers. A struggle ensued, a queen fighting with the raw desperation of a mother. But it was hopeless. She was overpowered and informed that she was to be taken away immediately. She was not even allowed to say goodbye. As she was escorted from the palace that had been her prison and then her paradise, a prisoner herself, she could hear the faint cries of her baby, a sound that would haunt her for the rest of her short life. As dawn broke over the city, the new regime moved to consolidate its victory. Guldberg's propaganda machine roared to life. Official announcements proclaimed that the king and the kingdom had been liberated from the tyrannical grip of a foreign usurper. The news was greeted with orchestrated scenes of public jubilation. Mobs, incited by the conspirators' agents, roamed the streets, smashing the windows of known Struensee supporters. The air was filled with a sense of righteous patriotic fervor. It was a moral crusade, a cleansing of the nation. The people, fed for months on a diet of scandal and patriotic resentment, celebrated the fall of a man whose reforms many of them had never understood, but whose affair with the queen was a sin they could all condemn. Struensee and his closest ally, Count Enevold Brandt, were thrown into the dungeons of the Copenhagen citadel. The queen was transported under heavy guard to the foreboding Kronborg Castle, the legendary Elsinore of Shakespeare's Hamlet, now her prison. The interrogations began almost immediately. The new regime needed confessions to legitimize their coup. Struensee, initially composed, was subjected to relentless psychological pressure. His interrogators, led by a panel of his sworn enemies, played on his fears, threatened him with torture, and held out the false promise of mercy. His spirit, once so arrogant and indomitable, began to crack. They wanted him to confess to every possible crime against the state. But above all, they wanted one thing: a full, detailed, and humiliating confession of his carnal relations with the queen. After weeks of torment, broken and exhausted, he gave them what they wanted. He recounted every detail of their affair, a final forced betrayal of the woman he loved. Meanwhile, at Kronborg, the queen's interrogators used this confession against her with sadistic cunning. They told her that Struensee's life was in her hands. If she confessed, they lied. The king, in his mercy, might be inclined to spare him and allow them both to live in quiet exile. Clinging to this sliver of false hope, desperate to save the man she loved, Caroline Matilda signed a full confession of her own. she had fallen into their trap. The trials, which took place in April, were a public spectacle and a legal farce. The verdict was never in doubt. A special commission stacked with the new regime's supporters found both Struensee and Brandt guilty of high treason. The primary charge against Struensee was lèse majesté, that he had illegally usurped the king's power. But the evidence that truly condemned him in the court of public opinion was his confessed affair with the queen. It was presented as the ultimate proof of his corrupt and treasonous nature. On April the 25th, 1772, the sentences were read. They were designed to inflict the maximum amount of terror and degradation, a brutal message to anyone who might ever dream of challenging the established order again. Both men were sentenced to have their right hands, the hands that had signed the decrees and struck the king, cut off while they were still alive. Then they were to be beheaded. And finally, their bodies were to be publicly dismembered, drawn and quartered, with the pieces to be displayed on wheels at the city limits, left to rot as a feast for the crows. 3 days later, on the morning of April 28th, the sentences were carried out. A crowd of 30,000 people, nearly half the population of Copenhagen, had gathered to witness the gruesome spectacle. The atmosphere was a grim mixture of morbid curiosity and righteous bloodlust. Count Brandt was led to the scaffold first. As Struensee was forced to watch from a nearby carriage, his friend was executed with savage brutality. The axe fell once for his hand and again for his head. Then it was Struensee's turn. He climbed the scaffold, a man utterly broken. In his final weeks, under the guidance of a prison priest, he had undergone a profound religious conversion, renouncing his life of reason and returning to the faith of his father. He knelt before the executioner's block, a disgraced revolutionary, a failed idealist, a lover whose passion had cost him everything. The axe fell, the crowd roared. The life of Johann Friedrich Struensee, the German doctor who had dreamed of remaking a kingdom in his own image, was over. His body was dismembered as the sentence demanded, and the pieces were mounted on spikes along the main road into the city, a hideous and potent symbol of the brutal restoration of the old order. The Enlightenment in Denmark was dead, its dreams dismembered alongside the body of its greatest champion. But one question still lingered. What would be the fate of the queen? The brutal execution of Johann Friedrich Struensee was not an end, but the beginning of a final agonizing chapter. With her lover's dismembered body displayed as a gruesome warning on the road to the capital, Queen Caroline Matilda remained a prisoner, her fate hanging in a delicate, dangerous balance. The new regime, led by the Dowager Queen Juliana Maria and Ove Høegh-Guldberg, had tasted blood. To them, the adulterous queen was as guilty as her lover, and many in their conservative faction clamored for her to face a traitor's death as well. But Caroline Matilda was not a common-born German doctor. She was a princess of Great Britain, the sister of one of the most powerful monarchs in the world, King George III, and her family was not about to abandon her. When news of the Queen's arrest and the execution of Struensee reached London, it was met with shock and outrage. The treatment of a British princess was seen as a grave national insult. King George III, though known for his own rigid morality, was fiercely protective of his family's honor. A flurry of furious diplomatic messages was exchanged between London and Copenhagen. When the Danish court prevaricated, the British response was swift and unambiguous. A squadron of Royal Navy warships was dispatched to the Baltic Sea, anchoring just off the coast of Denmark. It was a stunning piece of 18th century gunboat diplomacy, a thinly veiled threat that if any further harm came to Caroline Matilda, there would be war. The new Danish regime, for all its patriotic bluster, was in no position to challenge the might of the British Empire. They were forced to the negotiating table. After tense and protracted talks, a bitter compromise was reached. The marriage between Christian VII and Caroline Matilda would be formally annulled, the signed confession of adultery providing the legal grounds. The Queen's life would be spared, but she would be stripped of her title, her honors, and, most cruelly of all, her children. She was to be banished from Denmark forever. Her final day on Danish soil was one of profound and silent sorrow. As she was escorted from her prison, she was forced to endure the ultimate cruelty, a final formal separation from her 2 children. She would never again hold her son, the 4-year-old Crown Prince Frederick, nor her infant daughter Louise Augusta, the child born of her love for Struensee. This forced separation from her children was a wound from which she would never heal. As her ships sailed away from the Danish coast, leaving behind her throne, her lover's ghost, and the 2 living pieces of her heart, the once vibrant Queen of Denmark was a broken woman. She was only 20 years old. Her exile took her to Kelle Castle, a quiet, stately residence in Hanover, a German territory then ruled by her brother. Here, she established a small, melancholy court. The bright, vivacious girl who had arrived in Denmark just 6 years earlier was gone, replaced by a somber figure cloaked in grief. She was known for her immense charity to local orphans and the poor, perhaps seeking to give the maternal love she was forbidden from bestowing on her own children. Her days were spent writing letters, playing music, and staring for hours at the miniature portraits of Frederick and Louise Augusta she had commissioned. It was a life of quiet, unending sorrow, a half-life haunted by what she had lost. In the spring of 1775, just 3 years after her exile began, tragedy struck one final time. Caroline Matilda fell gravely ill. The official diagnosis was scarlet fever, though rumors of poison, administered by Danish agents, have never entirely faded away. She died on May 10, 1775. On her deathbed, she reportedly penned a final letter to her brother, proclaiming her innocence of any treasonous plot against the Danish state. Her final words were not of a queen, but of a woman who felt she had been profoundly wronged. The tragic life of Caroline Matilda, the girl who became a queen, a lover, and an exile, was over. She was just 23 years old. Back in Denmark, the Guldberg regime was firmly in control. They embarked on a systematic campaign to erase every last trace of the Struensee era. His Enlightenment reforms were rolled back with a vengeance. Censorship was reinstated, the privileges of the nobility were restored, and the Danish language was promoted in a wave of conservative nationalism. The court became a pious, rigid, and deeply insular place, and the king at its center. Christian VII remained a king in name only. He was a ghost haunting his own palace, a living symbol of the regime's legitimacy, trotted out for state occasions, but otherwise kept in near total isolation. His mental state deteriorated further, his days a blur of childish amusements and terrifying psychotic episodes, managed by keepers who treated him with a mixture of pity and fear. He would outlive his wife, his lover, and all his enemies, finally dying of a stroke in 1808 after a long, sad, and empty reign of 42 years. But history holds a final stunning irony. The regime built on the ashes of Struensee's reforms would itself be brought down by a palace coup in 1784, and the leader of this new coup was none other than Christian's own son, the now 16-year-old Crown Prince Frederick. Having come of age, he seized power from his uncle and the Guldberg faction, taking his father's place as regent. And in the decades that followed, Frederick, The boy who Struensee and his mother had tried to raise as an enlightened prince would slowly and cautiously reintroduce many of the very same reforms that Struensee had died for, including, most famously, the complete abolition of serfdom in 1788. The seeds that Struensee had planted so violently, it turned out, had taken root after all. So what is the lasting legacy of this incredible story? On the surface, it is a tale of political failure, of an idealistic revolution that crashed and burned, but its true significance runs far deeper. It remains a raw and powerful exploration of the human frailty and power, showing how the personal vulnerabilities of a troubled king and a lonely queen could create a vacuum that changed a nation. It is an unforgettable story of love, reform, and tragedy, a testament to how a passionate, forbidden affair became inextricably linked with a grand project of social engineering, with both ending in ruin. And above all, it is a heartbreaking portrait of the loss of power and sanity, a reminder of how easily the lines between personal passion and political ambition can blur, and how devastating the consequences can be. The story has echoed through the centuries, its potent blend of madness, love, and political intrigue inspiring countless books, plays, and films. And the children at the heart of the scandal lived on. Frederick became King Frederick VI, a respected reform-minded monarch, and Princess Louise Augusta, La Petite Struensee, grew up at the Danish court, her striking resemblance to her mother's executed lover, a silent, lifelong testament to the truth of the affair. In the end, this is not just a story about kings and queens and political decrees. It is a profoundly human tragedy. It's the story of three young people, a king trapped in the prison of his own mind, a queen starved of love in a gilded cage, and a doctor blinded by his own brilliant ambition, whose lives collided at a unique moment in history. Their story serves as a timeless and chilling reminder of the immense human cost of political idealism, the devastating consequences of suppressed emotions, and the fragile, beautiful, and often tragic nature of the human heart when it is placed under the unbearable pressures of a crown. It reminds us that behind the grand sweep of history, behind the dates and the battles and the laws, there are always intimate personal stories of love, loss, and suffering that truly shape our world